spring vacation?
It was super fun. Horrible.
It was great. And
Mine, I had none. Well, Andy, I don't know what you want to talk about today. We can talk about where things stand in the legislative session. We can talk about Real ID. We can talk about the fact that we're going to be going into overtime and special sessions because the legislature is not finished coming to any kind of a resolution on education funding, much less an overall operating budget. So you tell me how you want to proceed, or you kids tell me how you want to proceed.
yeah, I mean, honestly, I was telling them right before we started that this is our last session. So if they have any questions for you, this is the time to ask them. And that I know the legislative session is almost complete.
Right.
Even though that overtime is coming.
So
but yeah, whatever.
I'll give an overview for everybody if you want to do that, and then open it up to questions.
Perfect. And if we could end somewhere around 2:35 or so, I have some reflective questions to ask them, and I want some time before they get all antsy and getting out here ready to go for the weekend.
That sounds good.
All right.
So the legislature is scheduled to adjourn on Sunday, and the House and Senate have both put forward some operating budget proposals. It's about $43 billion, I'm sorry, in the Senate, and $44.8 billion in the House. And the differences are not really too substantial for the majority of the budget. However, the House proposes to spend about $1.8 billion more than what is projected to be raised in the current revenue system. So the House put forward a tax package that would raise about $2 billion to $3 billion over the course of the next couple of years. And they have not taken a vote on that tax package. That tax package is really where the sticking point is, where the Senate is saying to the House, look, you haven't given us a budget yet unless you give us a budget that also has the same amount of revenue to match your spending. And the Senate claims that they have put forward a budget that matches with the revenues that are coming in. It's not exactly true in all cases, but they at least put forward a package that did include a new revenue stream for the state. And what they're telling the House, the Senate's telling the House, is you give us both the spending wish list as well as the revenue package, and we can sit down and talk. And the House is saying, no, 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 no. Let's talk about what our budget should look like, and then we'll talk about what new taxes would go into place. So two philosophical differences on how you approach a spending budget, an operating budget, and that is really what is kind of creating the roadblock in any negotiations. The two other budgets that are generally adopted at about the same time that the operating budget is adopted are the capital budget, which is the budget to build the buildings throughout the state, particularly K-12 schools, matching funds for K-12 schools. That budget is not going to get voted upon until the operating budget gets done, because there's a lot of trading of votes for parts of the capital budget you might want, and in order to give your vote on the operating budget, and vice versa. The transportation budget really funds all of the road projects throughout the state. That has a wholly separate revenue stream that goes with it. And so that budget actually did pass today in the House. It passed in the House yesterday. It's going to be passed out of the Senate today, and that budget will get done. So that takes at least one of the big pieces off the table. but the operating budget and the capital budget are going to keep us here for at least another 30 days. And it's my opinion and that of most of the folks in Olympia that we'll be here in June as well, long after you guys have finished your work at school, and we'll still be here trying to finalize some kind of a budget for the state. And the fiscal year for the state, where they kind of have a drop dead date, is July 1st. And so if they don't come up with an agreement by July 1st, then they're going to have to come up with a spending plan for at least the month of July that will carry all the state operations forward. Maybe just the most necessary operations, funding your police, your firefighters, some of your other essential employees. It could be a bit of a mess politically, as well as in the everyday lives of the people of the state of Washington, if they don't come to a agreement by July 1. So we're going to be here for a while, and if you all want to come down and see what's going on, you're certainly welcome. I would expect that if you came down before the agreement is reached, you probably wouldn't see much, because most of these activities are going to be happening behind closed doors and via email and letter exchange between the two bodies, the House and the Senate. At the same time that they're trying to negotiate an overall budget, you do have 8 education funding leaders who are going to be negotiating on a new education funding plan to meet the requirements of the Cleary decision. And it's my expectation that the 8 leaders are going to be meeting 5 days a week for the next couple of months to try and hash out some way of getting to an agreement on that. Again, there's differences between the House and Senate on how to go about funding education. Excuse me. The House is hoping to use a similar funding model that's in place right now, called a prototypical school model, which kind of divides up the number of students and then says, okay, if you've got 500 students, then you need X number of teachers, you need X number of administrators, you need X number of classified, which would be your bus drivers and your janitors and maybe some of the secretaries and things like that in your principal's office there, and drive that funding that way. The Senate, on the other hand, is saying, let's blow that whole model up and just give a set amount of funding per student to each of the school districts. So if you're Franklin Pierce School District and you've got 6,800 students, which is give or take what you guys have, then we're going to send $10,000 per student, and Franklin Pierce School District will get $6.8 million, I think is what that adds up to. And then the district would then decide how to divide the money among the high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools. 2 completely different philosophies about how you go about funding education, and really quite controversial. So that in itself is going to take some time. So that's kind of where things stand right now. The legislature will finish up its actual work today. They're going to be in what they call pro forma, which means informal sessions on Saturday and Sunday, and then they'll adjourn the regular session on Sunday, and then the new session will begin on Monday at 10 a.m. So on the Real ID bill, which all of you were kind of tracking, the Real ID has passed now finally in both the House and the Senate. That was part of the transportation budget agreement that they had to get to a resolution on that issue. I believe that they decided that they're going to set the fee for these Real ID documents at about $90 per license. Don't quote me on that. In fact, what I'd like you to do is to go to the website, ledge.wa.gov, look at the bill as passed by the legislature. You're going to see variations of the bill. Look at the bill as passed by the legislature, and that will outline what the final cost of that real ID is going to be. There were still a number of no votes on that bill as it came out of the Senate yesterday. And a lot of it still had that issue of, does this real ID, in a way, tell a police officer or a federal agency person that you are not a documented citizen of the U.S. if you don't have real ID? And it's still it's a valid concern. It's a very valid concern, especially in this day and age when the Immigration and Custom Enforcement is ramping up their efforts to identify those who are not here legally and detain them, and in some cases deport them. And but the bottom line is that the state really had no choice, because the federal government was going to force this real ID. And so there were a number of statements on the floor of the Senate yesterday just saying that people did not want to vote for this, but they understood that Congress had actually tied their hands. And again, gets back to the issue of the separation of powers and different governments, where the U.S. government has dictated what all 50 states have to do. And in this case, a couple of states like Washington held out to the end, excuse me, but really didn't have any choice but to pass this law. And pretty good education, I think, for all of you as to the interplay between the federal government, the state government, and then how that impacts a person's life on a day-to-day basis. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions from all of you.
Whitney wants to know how effective the real ID is going to be. Huh? In your opinion?
Well, let's see. The Department of Licensing will probably implement. It takes some time for agencies to get these laws put into place and actually ramp up the staff and get everything put in place to actually start issuing those IDs. It'll probably take 3 to 6 months for that to take place. I would argue that the first signs of the success or failure of this law will begin to show in January of 2018, and we'll really see the impacts of it, whether it harms some of those immigrant laborers that are both in Eastern Washington and in Western Washington in the April to August and September timeframe, when a lot of your agricultural crops are coming into production. So the state's agricultural crops really start with asparagus, which is growing now and being harvested right now. You're seeing fresh asparagus in your grocery stores, I hope. And then the raspberries begin to come in, the strawberries start to come in, blueberries come in a little bit later after that, and then potatoes start getting harvested in the middle of the summer, onions, some of your other beans and products of that nature. And then in the, well, cherries, I guess, start in June. So you'll see the cherry crops coming in, and then apples come in the fall. So that's when a lot of your immigrant labor starts coming into the state and providing the workforce that we need to harvest all of the agricultural commodities in our state. So I have one quick question. This is kind of a trivia question for anybody. How much is overall the gross domestic product for agriculture in the state of Washington? How much do you think that that industry is in the state of Washington?
4.2 billion.
What was that answer?
Said 4.2 billion.
A little bit high, but not far off.
3 billion.
3 billion. That's exactly right. $3 billion. How do you think that compares with the Boeing company, who produces airplanes, hires all these people, puts seats and stuff into airplanes, buys big engines from General Electric and sticks them on the plane and sends them out? How do you
22
think
billion.
that compares?
22 billion.
Nope.
I think Boeing's lower. Lower? Is it lower?
It's lower than agriculture overall. Boeing's impact is around, it's just under 3 billion, and agriculture is just over 3 billion. So kind of gives you an idea of the scale of agriculture in the state of Washington. It's a lot bigger.
Overall GDP, like all of it.
Of the state of Washington?
Yeah, I was just curious. You know?
Well, when you've got a $42 billion budget, you've got to figure that our overall GDP, you put Amazon in there, you put Microsoft in there, I bet it's got to be 100 plus. That's a really good question. I guess we got to find out. That I bet you could find that out. You got to Google it. It'll be out somewhere.
GDP, gross domestic product. We have a Googler in the back over here. She's gonna check it for us.
Excellent. Gross domestic product for the state of Washington.
I have a question. Charlie, what was your day like today? And if you haven't done a whole lot today, maybe yesterday. What's your your day last couple of days? What did you do?
Well, so on Tuesday, I was really busy trying to get the school siding bill passed, which is a bill that would actually benefit Franklin Pierce as well as Bethel School District and Tacoma and 27 other school districts around the state, that would allow the district to build a new school just outside of the urban growth areas in the counties where they are located, because there's land available for those schools, and it's not necessarily available inside the urban growth area. And the governor's office, some of the people at Department of Commerce were having issues with that bill. They kind of came in late. I've been negotiating this thing for 5 years, to be honest with you. We've been working on the thing. We got it passed out of the Senate last week, and then on Tuesday, the House voted it, the final version of that bill, out of the House on a vote of 81-15, which is a really good vote, and it's now down at the governor's office. Subsequent to that, the governor's office has been making some rumblings that they might veto parts of it or all of it. So I've been working with school districts like yours to get letters into the governor's office urging him to sign the bill. And the governor's going to have a tough decision, because he's got a philosophical desire for environmental protection, and part of that goes with making sure that growth stays within the urban core. And then the other philosophical problem with education being the paramount duty, and with the growth of the state's population, we have to find new schools for the students to accommodate them in new rooms. If Franklin Pierce, I know Franklin Pierce is growing, you need a new elementary or a new middle school, one of the two, and you're looking at some land that lies just outside the urban growth area. Really not, I mean, it's all within the Spanaway area, but it's just outside this little artificially drawn line. And if the governor vetoes this bill, it creates problems for Franklin Pierce. So, we're going to urge the governor to sign that thing. We'll see what happens in the next 20 days. Right after that bill got finished, I had to turn my attention to another piece of legislation that I've been working on related to the recycling of mercury-containing lights, like the light bulbs that are above your heads there. Mercury is a toxic chemical. If it's in a vapor form, it can have neurological impacts on people. And so we've got a mercury light recycling program operating in the state. We needed a small tweak to that statute, and I worked to get that bill out of the Senate. Had a little problem. The House, the bill started in the Senate, passed out of there on a 49-0 vote, which is obviously wonderful for me. It got over to the House. The House amended it with some modest amendments, which I agreed to because that's what the Department of Ecology really wanted, and my clients were okay with that, and passed it out of the House on a vote of 98-0. And when it got to the Senate was unclear as to why the House had made those amendments. So they voted to not concur with the House amendments, sent it back to the House saying, please remove your amendments. The House on Tuesday said, no way, we like our amendments. Sent it back to the Senate. So it became something of a ping pong ball, which is a terrible thing for a lobbyist when you have your bills moving back and forth between the two bodies and everybody supports the underlying concept. So I worked for the last 2 days to try and get the Senate to understand what the House amendments were to the bill, why we liked those amendments, and get them to concur. And actually, it was 7:30 last night when the Senate finally concurred, voted my bill out on a vote again of 49-0. It's on its way to the governor's office, but thank God it got out last night, because today the Senate really has been not taking floor action, and I probably would not have gotten that bill to pass if they hadn't taken the action on it last night. So my last several days have been busy trying to get bills adopted and sent out to the governor's office, and now asking the governor to sign those bills in total, please not veto parts of them. So that's been my last 3 or 4 days.
Patients asking a question. Anybody else have another question? Patient says.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay, what is it?
What were you talking about earlier about the funding for like firefighters and other jobs like that?
Will you rephrase that question? I want to.
What was it?
She was asking about, you mentioned something about funding for firefighters.
Oh, yeah.
She was just wondering what that was.
You want a little more detail around that? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, please.
Okay. So when the state has a fully funded budget, you've got all its agencies working on their various issues every day. When we get to these situations, and this has not happened very often, but it happened 2 years ago, and I expect it's going to happen again this year. When you get up to the deadlines for funding, because the government can only operate on the money that is appropriated from the legislature to it, when you get up to these deadlines where the funding gets cut off, then if there's not going to be some kind of an overall agreement on the budget, the legislature has to decide what are the essential government functions, and the key term there is essential government functions that have to keep moving forward while you're trying to negotiate the remainder of the budget. The Attorney General a couple years ago outlined what they believe from a legal perspective, are essential government functions. And one of those is the police power of the state. You have to have law and order. So your state troopers would continue to be funded. Your National Guard would continue to be funded. You also have to have safety for your citizens, and that includes your firefighters, your wildfire protection, some of those types of functions that are essential to the management of a state government. And then there are certain entitlements that are either federally required to be paid to citizens of the state, or the state has obligated itself to pay. And those are generally in the Medicaid and Medicare arena for those people who qualify. Medicaid is a low-income health care program funded partly by the state and partly by the federal government. Medicare is a federally funded program, but the state has some interaction in that because the hospitals and doctors and nurses and other caregivers have a role to play. So if those are state-funded employees, they have to continue to be funded. The areas that, and I think foster care obviously would have to be funded as well, because you're not going to throw kids out of people's homes in foster care. The areas that might not be funded would include employees of, let's argue, the Department of Natural Resources, who are just looking at permits and maybe processing papers or applications for a new marina to be rebuilt somewhere. That's not going to be an essential public function. Your schools are already out of session, but if you had summer school, it might be that the summer school programs would not be funded at that point. If you're working for the Department of Ecology, let's argue, a lot of those employees are not essential to the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of the state, so they would be laid off. About 2/3 of our government employees would likely have to be laid off. Even if they wanted to come to work, they're told they cannot come to work. The doors are actually locked at the buildings in a situation like this. So about 2/3 of your state employees would not be working. The ones that would be working would be the employees who have a direct role in the essential operations of the state, including health, safety, and welfare. So that's kind of what I was referring to there. It's a mess. I mean, last time they did this, they calculated the cost of shutting down the government and then opening it back up. And you would think that it would be really simple. It's like, okay, the bell rang, you guys all go home. They lock the doors. That's not really how it works. You have to set up kind of a process for winding things down and explaining to people that you're no longer going to be processing the workload that you're responsible for. And then when you come back, you have to ramp back up. The cost of shutting down the government exceeded the cost savings of having the government shut down. So it goes back to some of the things that I've been trying to impart on all of you over the course of this session, Teach with TVW session, and that is that you need to be involved, you need to be engaged, you need to learn how to work with one another, you need to work with people who you may not otherwise always philosophically agree with, because in the end, we're all in this together. It's our society that we are trying to promote here, and your direct engagement, more importantly, your willingness to talk to each other, learn what the perspective of the other person, put yourself in the other person's shoes for a while, and try to understand that so that you can come to some kind of a negotiated agreement about how to work together. That will often prevent the kind of rancor and discord that I think that we're seeing in our politics more and more in the last decade or so. So again, I'm asking you to register to vote, get involved, talk to each other, try to understand each other, and try to understand that everybody's just trying to do the best that they can, and let's do it together. And that's what basically democracy is all about.
All right, Troy, I think that's about the time we have. I do want to say thank you for all the time you spent talking with us. I know I enjoyed it, and I think it's good to expose students to a variety of perspectives. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
We appreciate it a lot. You guys want to say thank you, and we'll
Thank
call
you,
it.
Charlie.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to all of you. You've been a great class, and I hope someday I might be able to get up there and see you in person. Maybe before the end of the year, I'll drop by and say hello. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.